I'm here in my 2016 Mazda 6 with the technology slash moonroof upgrade, which means that this has the BOSE sound system. This is just going to be a in-depth but not too long summarized overview of kind of what I did to learn more about this system. To give you some background, I wanted to mostly change out the entire audio system but keep the factory head unit. So new amp, new speakers, etc. And the issue was that it was really difficult to find much info on the sound system of this car. You would look into it and find a ton of stuff that's about the CX-5, the CX-9, earlier years, earlier generations. You would find a good amount of stuff for this car with the non-BOSE audio system, or stuff with the BOSE audio system, but the 2014 or 15 that had the old TomTom unit. So essentially, it was just real hard to get much concrete info, and you couldn't really be sure what exactly would apply to the 2016 6 with the BOSE system exactly, because most of the diagrams and most of the information people had provided was not for this exact car, and again, typically for the cars with the old TomTom unit or for the crossovers. So I luckily found one thread that at least gave me the idea on where to start. Somebody on the Mazda 6 club forums was saying that they wanted to add a sub to their car that luckily was the same exact configuration as this one, the 2016 6 with the BOSE upgrade again, but that they were really hoping to tap off of the quote-unquote original signal coming from the head unit. If you read through the thread, which is linked on my thread on the same forums, he ended up using the gray and blue wires from one of the cables that go from the head unit to the BOSE amp, as he put it. But unfortunately, he didn't give really any more detail than that. Didn't say what those wires exactly were. Were they a stereo signal? Were they one of the channels? Which wire was the positive and negative, or, you know, high in reference? So it wasn't really enough for me to be certain about what I could do with the system, but it was just enough to give me a starting point to begin looking at the car myself. In addition, I read and heard from people all over the place that were saying supposedly all the 3rd gen 6s with the BOSE sound system provide relatively clean 4-channel low-level signals from the head unit that you can just tap into directly. Don't need any high to low-level converter, don't really need to do anything super massive. There was talk of a potential bass roll-off towards the lower end of the spectrum, which, you know, wouldn't be that uncommon. But otherwise, supposedly that was the case. But again, it was really hard to find any concrete info, especially for this car exactly. Finding that thread and knowing where to kind of look was luckily a big breakthrough. While performing this investigation, I was largely referencing the Mazda 6 2014 workshop manual that you can either get from Mazda directly or find in various places online, because as far as I know, there is no workshop manual that's specific to the 15, 16, so on, etc. There pretty much is just the 14 workshop manual, and most of the stuff in it is applicable up to the current 16. Though some stuff did change throughout the models over the years. So at first, I wasn't too sure how much I could rely on the schematics for this car in the workshop manual for the 2014, since it's the 2016, but I am happy to report after the fact that most of the stuff I've checked out here should be exactly the same in various vehicles and not just the 2016 6. So first off, let me just restate that this is for all of the 6s with the BOSE system. None of this at all applies to the ones without it. If you have a 2014 or 15 6 with the old TomTom head unit, your BOSE amp is behind the glove box. If you have a 16 Plus, it is under the passenger seat. I believe this is definitely the case for the 17. I'm pretty sure it's the same for the 18 as well. Definitely the case for the 16. And also, if you have one of the newer models, again, 16 Plus, you have a tuner amplifier unit that's behind the glove box, where the BOSE amp used to be, that kind of just handles a lot of the input selection, etc. That is connected to the BOSE amp kind of as a middleman between the head unit. Now, I can say for certain that in the 2014 and 15, the signals I ended up looking at come from the head unit for sure, and you can tap them as far back as that. But in the 16 Plus, I only know for sure that the signals go between the tuner amplifier unit and the BOSE amp. I'm not at all positive if they still exist from the head unit to the TAL unit, or if they are created at the TAL unit. But either way, I would recommend tapping from the connector that's at the BOSE amp under the passenger seat or in the glove box if you have one of the older units, because I can guarantee that there, at least, that these signals that I'm going to get into exist at that point and are what you want to tap off of. It's also worth noting that this information will most likely largely apply to various other 3rd gen Mazda vehicles. It should be largely the same for the 3. I know the 3s with the BOSE system only have 9 speakers, but that is post BOSE amp. So the signals before the BOSE amp are probably fairly similar. I'm not sure on the amp's position in that car, but I believe that the connections to it at the amp are the same, though I'm not positive. This also should be fairly close for the crossovers, the CX-5, CX-3, CX-9 as well. But again, I can't promise it'll be exactly the same. However, I imagine it will be close enough that, you know, you could kind of use this video as a guide to check your own car out in case it is a little bit different and know what to look for. Other than this intro, this video will be broken up into 4 main sections that will cover kind of the 4 parts of what I wanted to check in this car to be confident about the upgrade I'm going to perform on it. The first is taking a look at what the BOSE head unit is sending to the BOSE amp. Again, supposedly, from what I've heard, it's supposed to send 4 channels just straight from the head unit to the amp that are fairly clean that you can tap into, but I wasn't sure of that before I looked. The second is checking how the head unit sends the audio information to the BOSE amp. You know, exactly what form does the signal take? How are the connections made? You know, is there anything we need to be aware of in terms of hooking up the aftermarket amp? The third is taking a closer look at the actual signal from the head unit itself. Is it truly clean? Is there a bass roll-off at the lower end of the spectrum? Is there any kind of processing that's already done at the head unit, or is it all done at the BOSE amp, etc.? And the last section looks at feature retention. So, you know, if you do install an aftermarket system this way and tap in pre-BOSE amp instead of post, are there any problems with that? Are there any features you lose? Do you lose any of the chime sounds or the tones generated by the car for whatever reason? If you went all the way and replaced all the speakers and want to ditch the BOSE amp, is that even remotely possible? Or does it handle other forms of processing and it needs to stay even if you don't lose any features by tapping before it? That kind of thing. The last thing to note is, if you're watching this on YouTube, I recommend checking out the description. There's a link to a corresponding thread that I'm making about this topic where you can kind of get a little bit more detail. And if you're watching this through the forum, you might also want to check it out on the YouTube page, because I'll have timestamps in the description, kind of skipping through the various parts if there's only a portion of this information you need to know. Okay, so for the actual connections from the head unit to the amp, here's what I did. If you look at the cable in the workshop manual that the user I was referring to said he used the gray and blue wires from, you'll see that it has 10 wires on it total. 2 of them, the red and black and brown wires, are for the audio pilot mic for the, you know, that BOSE processing effect that raises it to match your ambient volume level. So we can ignore those. Otherwise on the cable, there are only 8 wires left. Now, I thought, if the BOSE head unit is actually supposed to output 4 channel audio, and there are 8 wires left total, 2 per channel, that means that the wire could in theory be carrying 4 channels. And those are the signals we want right there. To test this, I took out the cable with the 8 wires in question and manually connected only the gray and blue wires that user was talking about to the amp, leaving the other 6 wires that I was guessing were different channels and the 2 audio pilot wires disconnected. So I am now playing the radio through the head unit with only the gray and blue wires connected like I mentioned. I also have the center point processing off and all of the fade, balance, bass, treble, etc. settings set back to default. And with these settings, which should be as regular of a signal as possible coming from the head unit, there is only audio coming out of the rear right side of the car, on the deck speaker and the door, and this means that the gray and blue wires are indeed one of the channels and belong to the rear right. Now there is some audio coming through the front right speaker, but that is because, as you probably know, they are used as woofers in this car, so I imagine no matter which channel you have connected, if you've removed others, you will always hear audio through that speaker. Here I'll see if I can get that effect across. So here's close to the door. And if I now go towards the other side of the car, it should get quieter. To keep this short, I will simply tell you the rest of the channel pairings instead of showing myself checking the rest of the wires. As I just demonstrated, the rear right channel is composed of the gray and blue wires, while the pink and light green wires make up the rear left channel, the red and green wires make up the front right channel, and the black and white wires make up the front left channel. So with the channel situation figured out, the next step was to take a look at exactly how the BOSE head unit is sending the audio data to the BOSE amp, just since that'll determine how the aftermarket amp can be hooked up. So just to give you a sense of how I did this, here we have the cable of interest, so to speak, again. Again, these are the two wires for the audio pilot mic that we're not worried about, but I initially am taking a look at the black and white wires, which is for the front left channel. Should be the same on all of them. So essentially what I did is, in Audacity here, I just made a simple test signal by just generating a sine wave and playing with it manually a bit. The point of this is it's asymmetrical vertically, so that if it's inverted for whatever reason, it would be easy to tell that that was the case. So here at the BOSE amp itself, what I did is I unplugged the cable and then manually, with just some free wire, connected just the front left channel, the black and white wires like I was saying. And then on the first channel of my O-scope, I have one probe hooked up to the black wire, and on the second channel, I have the other probe hooked up to the white wire. And then both probes are just kind of put on chassis ground. I'm just using the BOSE amp here since it's metal. So I played that test tone I showed a minute ago through the system and just checked it out on the scope real quick. And once I got what I was looking for, I just froze the scope's data acquisition and turned the car off because it would be impossible to hear me with that test tone playing. So here on the O-scope, I only have channel 1 on at the moment, which again is the probe going to the black wire on the top of that cable, which belongs to the front left channel. As you can clearly see here, this is a nice reproduction of that test waveform that I just showed you a minute ago. Now, since this reading isn't inverted like I somewhat alluded it may have been, that tells us that the black wire is the positive wire of the front left channel, though that's a little bit simplified. Generally speaking, there are two ways that this head unit, or any for that matter, can be sending data to the amp. The most common is using single-ended connections where each channel is sent using two wires, essentially a channel high and a channel low, and the signal is the voltage between these two, and the low wire is a common ground that is generally tied to chassis ground and shared among all of the channels and all other inputs and outputs in the audio system. The other, less common method is sending a differential signal. So this involves three wires. One, again, is a common ground, typically chassis ground, though in this case it is not tied to either of the other wires, and the other wires are floating. Then one of the other wires just sends the straight audio signal, while the other sends the same signal but inverted. The amp then receives these signals and checks the difference between them and amplifies that voltage. So that essentially means that it takes the one waveform, subtracts it from the other, and then only amplifies that. In the end, you end up with the original audio signal with twice the voltage that the regular and inverted signals on the individual wires have. The reason this is done is to combat noise. In theory, any noise picked up on these transmission lines coming from the head unit to the amp will be more or less the same on both the wire carrying the regular signal and the wire carrying the inverted signal, which means that at the end, when they are subtracted from one another, since the noise is an exact commonality, it's subtracted out entirely, which essentially makes the circuit immune to external noise, given that it is connected correctly. The reason this is less common is that one, it's more expensive, and two, it can limit the compatibility between equipment, since you may have to convert from differential to single-ended or vice versa, and that can require additional circuitry in between your components that, might turn some people off. So even if, relatively speaking, it's not too difficult to connect equipment that only handles differential input and output to equipment that only handles single-ended input and output, with just a little bit of helper circuitry in between, manufacturers know that their customers want their equipment to be as plug-and-play as possible. And because of this, most aftermarket head units you'll see use single-ended outputs because it's the simpler of the two. and ensures that not only will their equipment be more compatible with the other equipment they make, but also compatible with other manufacturers' equipment. So coming back to the O-scope here, with this alone, we don't know if this is a positive wire in a single-ended connection and the other is just a simple common ground, or if this is the positive wire in a differential connection and the other wire has the inverted signal. So to determine that other half of the puzzle, we simply turn on channel 2 here. And as you can plainly see, the signal on channel 2, which is again monitoring the white wire for the front left, is the exact inverse of the signal on the black wire. That tells us that that is definitely the negative wire, and also that this BOSE system is using differential connections. This is nice because if you are using an amp that accepts differential inputs, you'll have pretty good noise rejection between the head unit and your amp. If you aren't, that's fine, you just won't get the benefit of the noise rejection that this allows, and you'll have to rely on the shielding of the cables alone. And there's a simple circuit you can make to convert this to a regular single-ended connection, and some amps can accept a single-ended or differential without any additional circuitry in between. You just have to check the manual on the amp you're using. So to give you a sense of this differential output, here I took the difference between channel 1 and 2, and you can see the result is the purple waveform at the bottom. Unfortunately, the resolution of the math functions on this scope is pretty poor, so it's pretty jagged, but it still gives you a good idea. And as you can see, where the difference between the regular and inverted waveforms is the greatest, so is the amplitude of the differential waveform. So this at the bottom here is what your amp will actually amplify and send to your speakers in the end, as long as it accepts differential inputs. So just as kind of a sanity check, I have the AM radio on right now, and here is the black wire signal, the non-inverting signal from the head unit for the front left channel. And as you can see, this is clearly an audio waveform, and it is indeed following the sound I'm hearing from the radio. So this is definitely what we're looking for.
Like before, here are the final results of my findings for the signal polarities of each channel. Conveniently, the orientation is consistent across all of them, as the non-inverted signals are on the pins at the top of the cable, while the inverted signals are along the bottom.
To further ensure that this 4-channel signal coming from the head unit is kind of as we would expect or as we would hope and doesn't have any kind of weird processing happening to it, I created a stereo version of the test signal that I showed you earlier. It's the same as before, except that this time I added a square wave variant of the waveform as the right channel in this now stereo signal, just so that the right and left were easy to distinguish from each other. So I simply played this through the head unit, and I have all 4 channels of my scope going. I have channel 1 on the front left, channel 2 on the front right, channel 3 on the rear left, and channel 4 on the rear right. I apologize for the glare, but as you can see, everything lines up as we would hope it would. The channel 1, which was the front left, is clearly the left waveform. Same thing for the front right, rear left, rear right. The lefts are the sine wave based waveforms, and the right channels are the square wave based waveforms. These are all shown at the same vertical scale, which means all of their amplitudes are roughly the same, and therefore the volume of each channel is roughly the same. I will have a more empirical check of this on that forum post I mentioned earlier, but for now everything looks like it's pretty good. This test is also helpful because it shows us that all 4 channels are in alignment in terms of phase, as I've highlighted here with the cursors. This means that it's not necessary to apply any kind of time delays to any of the channels in order to get them into alignment for your aftermarket amp. There is a bit of distortion in the right channel square waves, but that's mostly due to what's referred to as Gibbs phenomenon, which you can look into on Wikipedia or anywhere on the internet.
Here I will show you the results of some basic signal analysis I performed that allow us to draw additional conclusions about the audio coming from the factory BOSE head unit. I will be simplifying the explanations and conclusions in this section to keep things as concise as possible. Feel free to research the following concepts on your own if you wish to understand them in more detail. My objective for these tests was to monitor each channel of the head unit while playing a known waveform and see if there were any significant discrepancies between the input and output signals. I primarily achieved this by using white noise as a test signal. This is because the frequency components that ideal white noise is composed of are all equal in terms of intensity. Therefore, it is easy to detect any equalization or frequency culling that occurs in a given system by studying its frequency response to white noise. You can observe this property by inspecting the spectrogram of uniform white noise that I generated using Audacity. As denoted by the legend on the right, the color of the graph at any given point indicates the power of that point's corresponding frequency at that point's corresponding time. The aforementioned property is made clear by the graph's monochromatic appearance. If you are more familiar with the use of equalizers, take a look at the left channel frequency spectrum of the same waveform that I generated with the help of MATLAB and the Fourier or Fourier transform. Notice how its frequency curve is relatively flat, just as the spectrogram is nearly all the same exact color. And for completeness sake, this is just to show you that the same is also true for the right channel. Before we move on, it is important that you have a basic understanding of how white noise is generated. Because I am using uniform white noise, samples at different amplitudes are randomly generated in a uniform distribution that more evenly cover the frequency spectrum as the number of samples is increased. This is demonstrated by the on-screen GIF. This means that as white noise is generated for a longer duration, and therefore with a greater number of samples, the closer it gets to having a perfectly flat frequency curve. Knowing this is important because while the examples I generated to demonstrate this effect to you were 10 minutes long, the limited memory of my scope restricted my measurements to 24-second intervals. So, since it is important to compare apples to apples, here are the spectrogram and frequency spectrum of uniform white noise with a 24-second duration. The overall result is the same, except that the noise's frequency curve is a bit more rough, which can also be seen as the snow effect that is now present in its spectrogram. Do note, however, the very small scale of the intensity or y-axis of the frequency spectrum, as the fluctuations of the curve are within an order of magnitude of 10 to the negative 4, and therefore are not as significant as they may seem at first. So, for all intents and purposes, this is still a very flat frequency response, and deviations from flatness to this degree in the following head unit tests should not be regarded as indications of the head unit performing equalization of any kind. With that explanation taken care of, here are the results from playing the same white noise through the head unit and observing it through the low-level signals I covered earlier. What I did was combine the front left and right into one stereo file, and the rear left and right into another stereo file, the spectrograms of which you are looking at now. Excitingly, the output waveform is exactly what you would expect for white noise, and shares the same even distribution property that I recently explained. Do not worry that the main color of the front and back spectrograms are not exactly the same as each other, nor the previous example. This is simply because the three were not recorded/generated at the same amplitude/volume. It is the overall pattern they share that is important, because it proves that the factory BOSE head unit does not perform any kind of equalization, and that all equalization that occurs in the factory system must happen at the BOSE amp. It is worth pointing out that there is a slight dip in intensity at the very top of each graph, but this is a non-issue as it occurs outside the audible frequency range for humans, and from my experimentation, seems to be more a limitation of the laptop I use to play the sound rather than the BOSE head unit. Like before, here we have the frequency spectrum of the front left and right channels. They do show just the very beginning of the previously highlighted frequency dip, and the signals from their time-based perspective are a touch rough at the extreme edges, but again, this is more related to the equipment I am using, and overall this is a great result. Finally, here are the frequency spectrums for the rear left and rear right, just to show that the same is true for them as well. Real fast, as an extra test, here is a comparison between the input and output for a 24-second segment of a random song I grabbed from my library, both adjusted just a hair to try and match their volumes as perfectly as possible. I arbitrarily chose to show you the rear left and right results here, since my findings were the same for all four channels. The graphs aren't exactly the same, but only have a few minor discrepancies that are most likely due to my use of non-professional grade equipment. Here is the MATLAB frequency spectrum comparison between the input and output signals for the left channel, and here is the same for the right channel. The last result to show you is this zoom in towards the base end of the spectrum for the white noise input. There was speculation by someone with a CX5 that the factory head unit may have a bass roll-off curve to protect the weak BOSE woofers in the front doors. While that makes sense, and I cannot speak for that car exactly, I can safely say, given this graph, that if such a thing does occur in the 2016 Mazda 6, it happens within the BOSE amp and not the head unit.
Okay, so for feature retention, the first thing is just to make sure that the general volume controls happen pre the BOSE amp. By all means, they should, but, you know, it's just good to make sure. So here I only have the front left plugged in, and as you can see, we have the radio on the scope. And, you know, forgive me, it will get loud, but as I turn the volume up and back down, you can see it clearly affects the output. So the volume is controlled before the BOSE amp. Okay, so for the other features, again, I'm doing this with center point turned off. We can see here that currently everything is at the default settings, if it can focus. So unfortunately my laptop battery is garbage and I had to plug it in, and the adapter is so poor that it is having a little bit of an effect on the reading on my scope, but it's no worries, it doesn't actually have an effect on these observations right here. So right now I have the bass turned all the way down, and I'm playing a 100 Hertz pure sine tone through the aux input that we can see here. And now I'm not actually touching the volume, but I'm going to turn the bass control all the way up. As you can see, that does raise the amplitude, and back down and up again. So that confirms that the bass control does happen before the BOSE amp. I will warn you, the sound is horrible and you may want to turn down your volume, but the results are the same for the treble control. Just turning up the treble with a 8 kilohertz tone. And back down. I won't do that again because it is a horrible sound and you get the point. Alright, so now for the fade settings. Since only the front left is plugged in, with the fader all the way to the front, we should see the same volume as we back it off towards the center. But then once it begins to fade to the rear, we should see the amplitude drop as it drops the front signal only, since this is, again, the front left. Down to center. No change. Now down to rear. As you can hear, there is no sound at all because it is all the way to the rear, and the rear is not plugged in. Back up. Last but not least, we have balance. Again, since this is the front left, nothing should matter for all of the range from the left to center, and then it should fade down as we go towards the right. Down to center. No change. Down to right. And back up. Okay, so that confirms that all of the head unit controls happen at the head unit, and you do not lose any of them by tapping before the BOSE amp. Another important thing to check in terms of feature retention is everything related to calls and voice. So for example, here's a little bit just to show that Google Assistant in Android Auto still works when you're tapping audio this way. I don't have the speakers connected at the moment, but the scope is currently on the front left channel, which is where I believe everything call and assistant related comes through. So I'm just going to ask it to do something arbitrary, and you'll be able to see on the scope the clear ding ding that happens when you first prompt it, and you'll also be able to see it clearly responding. Okay, Google, what can you do? So that was the 2 sets of dings, and it's giving its little blurb about what it does when you ask it that question. So I can confirm that Assistant completely works if you tap before the BOSE amp, as well as any Bluetooth calling, whether that's through Android Auto or through the default Bluetooth input on the kind of Mazda side of things on the head unit. And yeah, the last thing is any of the various chime sounds that can happen within the car, which we will now check. Okay, so this last test is real easy. Bit hard to see, but BOSE amp completely unplugged, which means that if any of the chime sounds rely on it, or anything else in the car for that matter, it should be fairly obvious. So let's start. All right, with just that on, we should get the, yep. So there's the chime letting you know, your car is still partially on. Do not walk away from it. Now in accessory mode, we should get the seat belt chime. So that still works. Turn on the headlights. Get this chime for the intensity. Yep. So it seems for sure that all of these sounds are on a completely separate circuit that is totally handled by a separate buzzer, I'll call it. You won't lose any of those by tapping in before the BOSE amp. Alright, so the car is fully on now, engine started, and as you can see, we don't have any kind of weird stuff going on. Only light on the dashboard is the engine warming light. So far, nothing seems out of the ordinary, other than I'm sure there is no sound. So the last thing to check is the sounds that are made for the blind spot monitoring if you are backing up or changing lanes. I'm gonna go double check these real quick, but the last time I checked, they did work with the BOSE amp unplugged. Okay, so I can't get it on video since I have to drive, but I just double checked. The ding alerts for your blind spot do also work with the BOSE amp totally get disconnected, so you won't have to worry about losing those either if you tap before it or decide to remove the BOSE amp completely. So yeah, it seems like you don't lose anything whatsoever, and that all of the other sounds in the card are handled by a completely separate circuit. So I guess as a quick side note, if you look at the connections of the BOSE amp to the rest of the system, there's the 8 wires that I just went over for the 4 channels. There's the 2 wires for the audio pilot mic. There's another set of unlabeled wires, 2 of them, but I believe that those are just feedback for the audio pilot mic to the TAL unit. And otherwise, there's a couple grounds, a wire that goes to the fuse block that I believe is just for power, and another wire that goes to the accessory line that I believe is just a turn-on wire for when the car is in accessory mode or the engine is started. And then other than all that, there are 2 wires that connect the amp to the CAN bus of the car. However, from me driving around, I don't notice anything out of the ordinary whatsoever. And so I think it's reasonable to say that that connection might sheerly just be for data from the head unit, perhaps to tell it to enable audio pilot and center point if those options are enabled, or a few other things related to the entertainment system only, and that it could be quite possible that you can remove the BOSE amp outright if you replace all of your speakers. I can't say that with 100% certainty, but from what I'm seeing and kind of from going through that in my head, I think there's a strong chance that you could. It doesn't hurt to just leave it connected anyway, but if you don't want to have to worry about completely splicing the signals off and adding an extra wire instead of being able to just cap the wires that you do splice, you probably can remove the amp outright. Surprisingly, it seems like despite all the annoyances of the BOSE system, that tapping off of the BOSE head unit pre-BOSE amp might actually be a pretty good option. Alright, so that pretty much covers everything that I was able to figure out by taking a look at this car. Hopefully this helps you if you have a 2016 6 with the BOSE system or a similar Mazda with the BOSE system. So yeah, I'm glad if watching this helped you out, and I'll likely post a follow-up video and reply on the thread once I get my system installed, just so I can confirm that everything was able to hook into the stock head unit without any issues, as the results from this video would suggest. Thanks for watching.